I got to talk to you a little bit before I get into the sermon. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. Hear that phrase again, when we all get to heaven. We got a call this week from our representative at the Vanderbloemen Agency. They are the people who are helping us with the search. And Jay said to us, you know, the theology of Jupiter First Church is what makes it unique. Now, we knew that. You'll know that when I explain it to you. Because you see, on one hand, we are a very conservative church. We will sing and we will mean when we all get to heaven. We sing it because we believe it. God has promised, I go to prepare a place for you, and when I go, I will come in again and take you to myself, that where I am, you shall be also. That's at the heart of our faith. I think about that, and I think, man, I hear him sing. I heard him sing at first service, and it touched me the same way. I can't wait. I can't wait to hug my mother again. I can't wait to see my brother. I can't wait to laugh with my dad. And one of the things I'm going to do for sure, you can trust this, is I'm going to make a special trip to the Rainbow Bridge. Now, those of you who love animals know what the Rainbow Bridge is. I'm going to have a long string of them right there, just waiting. And we're going to have a big circus together. Because I believe everything that brings love and joy into our lives is a gift from God. And when someone says to me, in the fullness of God's time, I'm going to see that first collie that I had when I was 8 years old. I'm going to see our first Springer Spaniel. I'm going to see them all. Because I believe that what God promises us when we all get to heaven is everything that will make our lives full and complete forever. That's the God we're messing with here. We're not talking about some mumbo-jumbo stuff. Now, I know. This is hard for linear logic people. They say, man, I can't figure that out. How are they going to get all those people there same time over all these years? How's this all? Listen, we're not in charge of how. We're just in charge of when. We're going to embrace it, and we'll understand it, and it's God's promise. I think of I reach back almost 50 years of ministry. In every church I ever served, I loved the people. And as I think of the individual churches, individual faces and voices come into, many of whom are already in the presence of the Master, I think of them, and I can't wait to see him again. When we all get to heaven, we believe in that. That's a big part of our theology, but here's another part, and here's what makes Jupiter First unique. We also are extremely inclusive theologically. That means there is not a person who can come through these doors who will not be accepted and loved who they are, as they are, where they are. No matter what their political choices may be, no matter what their sexual preferences may be, here, within the love of Christ, those people, all of us, are going to be accepted. That's what makes Jupiter First Church so special. And that's our challenge as we look to the future. We need to find someone who believes when we all get to heaven and means it when they say when we all get to heaven. That's the challenge. That's the promise. That's what we have to trust to him. So forgive me for taking a little trip with you and giving you a sermon in front of a sermon. But I want you to know that at the bedrock of Jupiter First Church is the promise and presence and person of an accepting, loving Jesus Christ. So pray with me. Thank you, Lord, for this place. Thank you for all these wonderful people. Thank you for those singers and David and the magic they do week after week. Thank you for Nancy and all the people who put together the things for our children and sit them up here and talk to them about the great gift of Christmas, which is you. What a wonderful thing for a 6-year-old or a 5-year-old to begin to understand. Thank you, Lord, for Jupiter First Church. To God be the glory. Amen. Now, I want to start the message, the big one. I want to start my main message this morning by asking you a question. Fancy? Anybody know who this guy is? Who is that? Anybody know? I'll give you a hint. This is the most famous author ever to come out of the state of North Carolina. Anybody got a hint? How about Thomas Wolfe? That's Thomas Wolfe. Now, I'll ask you another question. What was probably the most famous thing Thomas Wolfe ever said? He not only said it, he wrote a book under the same title. Thomas Wolfe said, "You can't go home again." Remember that? You can't go home again. But I just lift that up because I'm going to argue with it. I don't think it's true. You can go home again. Only problem is, when you get home again, home won't be the same and neither will you. Why? Because change never stops happening. It's perpetual. Several years ago, I went back to Illinois, and I was in the little town, it's not a little town anymore, my hometown of Bloomington. And I was hanging out with my siblings and old friends. And one afternoon, I got in my car, and I decided to take a little ride because we were raised 6 miles outside of Bloomington, Illinois, on Highway US 150 as you head toward Champaign. So I decided I'm going to go out and look at the old house. I want to see what that's like. So I get in the car, and I drive out there, and I pull up on a side road right adjacent to our old home. And I hardly recognize what I'm looking at. The house used to be pink with white shutters. Now it's white with black shutters. Big driveway running up to the house, flanked on both sides when I lived there, with 2 huge flower gardens. I'm very familiar with those. They nearly cost me my life. My mother, on one occasion, a Saturday morning, said, "Barry, I want you to get into the flower gardens and just pull the weeds. I'll be back about noon." Well, I got in the flower gardens. They're big. And I'm looking at flowers, I'm looking at weeds, and I'm saying, this will take forever. So I mowed them. I did. When my mother came home, she went bananas. She chased me around the house with a hatchet, yelling. And I'm running, and I'm guessing the neighbors are loving this. You know, there's Betty Johnson over there trying to kill one of her kids. Yeah, well, those flower beds are gone. They're all now overgrown with shrubs. And up by the front door was what we called the Christmas tree, big pine tree. And every year that we lived there, we'd go out and decorate that pine tree. We'd string lights on it. It was part of our house. Well, guess what? Today, that pine tree is over 25 feet tall. You'd have to have a crane truck to hang Christmas lights on that beauty. But that's not the thing that most disturbed me. I sat there in my car and I looked to my right, which would have been to the west of our home. And to the west of our home, there was about a 10-acre meadow with some trees here and there. And I spent many an afternoon as a kid out in that meadow with my dog and my BB gun, just horsing around, killing time. Well, guess what? Meadow's not there anymore now. It's full of streets and houses and big wheels. Everything changes. Life changes. Life never stops changing. Thought of this a year or so ago when we went up to Orlando and I pulled onto International Drive, and it made me think, the first time I went into Orlando that I could remember was probably 30, 35 years ago. And I loved International Drive. International Drive was full of restaurants and tourist attractions, all beautiful things. And I'm fascinated by that, you know, all the bright lights, sparkling, all this good stuff. Well, today, it takes you about an hour and a half to go a block and a half on International Drive. Some of you have been through this. Everything changes. You can't stop it. It just happens. I had the same thought this summer when Barbara and I went to visit our son Dane and his family, who live now in Austin, Texas. Dane's got 2 boys, and we went out to lunch one day at a wonderful Mexican restaurant there. And I'm sitting across the table from my son, and all of a sudden my mind slips into nostalgia. I'm looking at Dane and I'm thinking, man, that handsome guy sitting on the other side of the table was the same 3-year-old who used to sit on my leg. This is illegal now, you couldn't do it because they won't let you do it. But in those days, I could sit him on my left leg while I was driving the car and tell him he was helping me drive the car, and he'd put his hand on the wheel and we'd just go down the road, big time. That was my Dane, and now here he is. And I looked at him and I thought also of that 6-year-old Dane who one afternoon, for some reason, took a screwdriver and took our air conditioner, which was outside on a pad behind the house, a screwdriver and a pair of pliers. He took the whole thing apart. It was all spread out all over the yard. And guess who had no idea how to put that back together? I mean, not a chance. And then there was the gangly, teenaged Dane who went to Upper Arlington High School in Columbus, and there discovered that he loved lacrosse. Man, could he play lacrosse. I saw a lot of lacrosse games. I watched him play those games. Now he's sitting across from me in this restaurant with boys of his own on either side. And I'm thinking, now, this same Dane, every day, holds people's lives in his hands because he is an anesthetist. He spends every working day in the operating room with surgeons, and he takes care of all of the medications that are administered to a patient during surgery. Wow. Life changes. And even if you want to, you can't stop life from changing. Jerome Kagan, a professor at Harvard, put it this way, Francie. He said, change is a far more common experience in human development and in all human affairs than continuity. True, we prepare for continuity, but it's change we must always expect. In other words, even though we expect things to stay the same, they never do. But I can tell you one thing that is certain. One thing that is certain is that in the year 2017, America is going to experience change. And so is Jupiter First Church. That said, today I want to start a brief series of messages dealing with the very dynamics of change. And today I invite you to focus your attention along with me on a faith-centered philosophy of change. My goal is to equip all of you who care so much about this country and about this church with a faith base from which to move into and through the year that is to come. Perhaps no biblical writer better understood the concept of change than the writer of Ecclesiastes, alternately hailed as a master of reality and a prince of despair. Koheleth, that's what they called him. Koheleth was possessed with a very special understanding of the constantly shifting tides of life. And so he gives us these words in the 9th chapter of Ecclesiastes. He says, I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability. And here comes the kicker. For time and chance overtake them all. With these words, Koheleth puts his finger on the two dimensions around which the fortunes of change constantly evolve. Time on one hand, chance on the other. Because both time and chance are essential ingredients of human existence. The wise believer quickly learns, and this is the first point I want you to put in your pocket and take home with you today. The wise believer quickly learns change is a gift from God. William Cullen Bryant put it this way, Francie. He said, weep not that the world changes. Did it keep a stable, changeless state? That would be cause to weep. You see, there is no greater mark of God's connection with us as human beings than the ongoing impact of constant fluctuation around us. Hear me. We were not made to sit still. We were made to constantly improve and grow. Some of the old salts in here will remember this. How many recall a wonderful old black and white TV series called The General Electric Theater? Remember that? Way back. Some of you young ones forget it. You know, you weren't there. But the old ones know. The General Electric Theater. And there was a phrase that was quoted every time the General Electric Theater played, and it would come up at the end of the show, and they would say, at General Electric, progress is our most important product. You know what? It is the same for every child of God. Time and chance deny us all the absurdity of sitting still. Whether we like it or not, we are destined to change, and so is the world around us. Now let me illustrate. This week I decided, okay, I'm going to track something down from way back, and I want to measure how those things that happened way back then still affect us today. So I had to pick a year that I was going to look at. So I randomly chose the year 1940. Okay, now that, I had to reach back older than me. I was born in 43, so I went back before I was on this earth. I went back to 1940. Now, I want you to just consider the changes that unfolded then and their impact on us now. Number one, it was in 1940 that this guy, Francie, this guy named Sir Howard Walter Florey, an Australian pathologist, discovered penicillin and its curative effects on infectious diseases. Thanks to Florey, thousands of lives were saved during World War II. And today, the influence of antibiotics is largely created and credited for our rapidly increasing life expectancy. Life changes. And what about this contraption? Oh, yeah. This little beauty was invented 77 years ago. Invented by the people at Vought Sikorsky up in Connecticut. It is a weird-looking flying machine without any wings. It had just a seat for the pilot and a giant propeller mounted on top of it. And better yet, the doggone thing could take off straight up and land the same way. They called it a what? A helicopter. So today, these contraptions are not only the first line of support for American ground troops, they're also used for traffic control all over our nation and for emergency ambulance service, saving thousands of lives in America every day. Life changes. And that takes us to the miracle of Dunkirk. 77 years ago, the people of Britain, the common people of Britain, rose to the occasion as 340,000 of their finest young men were trapped by rapidly advancing Nazi forces on the beaches of Normandy. The call went out to the homeland. Our men are trapped. They will perish or be captured if we don't figure out how to save them. They only had to say it one time in Britain. And from the shores of that island nation came hundreds of boats, pleasure boats, fishing boats, commercial boats, not military boats. Hundreds and hundreds of them went across that English Channel and rescued the British troops. It was a magnificent moment. Here's a picture of it. They could have easily thrown up their hands and quit, but they didn't do that. They proved the unbelievable power of what a bunch of common people can accomplish against all odds. And to this day, there is a phrase in Britain that commemorates that event. That phrase is the Dunkirk spirit. When people run up against unbelievable odds and want to give up, it's not unusual for somebody in Britain to say, "Where is your Dunkirk spirit?" And guess what? Today, people flash back and forth across that English Channel, not on the water, but under it in a tunnel, on a train that permanently connects Britain to the European continent. Life changes. So the message is clear. Change. Just know this, understand it, recognize it, accept it. Change is the only totally predictable dimension of human existence. It is a gift from God to keep our eyes on the future and our attention glued to the ever-renewing, evolving world. That being true, the second piece of our faith-filled approach to change is the recognition that the manner in which you and I respond to change shapes our lives and determines our witness for Christ. It was Robert Grudem, the English professor from the University of Oregon, who told us there are two shortcuts to make you grow old very, very fast. Francie? Grudem said, if you want to grow old fast, number one, resist all change obstinately. If you want to continue to grow old very fast, worship change abjectly. And I would add a third dimension to Dr. Grudem's little formula. I would say the other thing that just makes you grow old so much you can't stand it, but you also can't stop it. The thing that makes you grow old is time. A funny thing has happened to me in Jupiter, Florida. I came here at 50. I will soon be 74. And I am no longer 50. And it's been a magnificent journey for which I will, for as long as I live, give thanks to God for this town, for this place, for these people, for this staff, for what we have done together over that period of time. I couldn't have planned it. I couldn't have designed it. I couldn't have put it together. God already had that taken care of. So I have an old friend from California who told me a great story that puts this in perspective. Guy's name is Roy Dunn. Roy was the senior minister for 27 years at the Good Samaritan United Methodist Church in Cupertino, California. And Roy, he's funny, he was brilliant, and he was a dear, dear friend for most of my career. Now, Roy's gone now, but boy, that phone would ring and it'd be Roy. There would be a lot of happy stuff going on there. But one time he told me this story. It was a story about preachers and churches and how they get along and sometimes don't get along. He said, well, this is a story about an old preacher who came to a church but didn't fit. He says, this old guy showed up and he was having an awkward time. They really didn't belong together, these two old people, these two old church families, the old minister and the congregation. The old minister was pious. His congregation was very progressive. The old minister was very somber. His people were like you guys. They were celebrative. They loved it. He was also always proper. They were, the best way to describe, they were footloose and fancy-free. You know what I'm talking about, yeah. Well, it was a bad match. And so the battle between the preacher and the congregation went on. Pastor was unhappy, so were the people. But the old preacher would not leave the church. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 7 years. Roy says, they irritated each other in the name of grace and for the sake of salvation. Well, that's a formula to jump off a cliff. So it wasn't good, not for the preacher, not for the church. And then one Sunday, Roy says the old boy climbed up into his pulpit and he piously addressed the congregation. He said, dearly beloved, after much prayer and great deliberation, I can announce to you today that the same dear, sweet, loving Jesus who called me to serve here has now called me to serve at Watkins Corners, and I'll be leaving within a fortnight, at which time the congregational choir leapt to their feet and began to sing, What a friend we have in Jesus. Isn't that gorgeous? Which takes us to the last part of our faith-centered approach to church. It's the only way to do this, folks. No matter what we say, what we do, and what we like, what we don't like, change is part of life. And what we do with it is an expression of our faith. So let's take a look at what we've learned. First, faith says change is a gift from God. Go home with that. Put it in your pocket. Second, we need to know the way we respond to change shapes both the world around us and our witness for Christ. When we get frumpy bumpy about change, we're really denying the power of God to make things great, even when we don't understand what comes next. And finally, we believers practice what I call an evergreen awareness to the possibilities inherent in ever change. What makes us think that our God can't make something great about what's coming at Jupiter First Church? And what makes us think that our God can't make something great out of what's happening in our country? We get so caught up in political titles, we make those titles more important than the God above them all. Put it in God's hands, I dare you. Put it there. Lay down your burden. Pick up God's promise. Trust not my tomorrow or your tomorrow or Trump's tomorrow. No, you don't have to trust those. Trust God's tomorrow. And be diligent looking for His hand at work. So I want to wrap this message up by telling you about a guy named Charles Garfield. Dr. Charles Garfield is the professor of clinical psychology out at the University of California in Berkeley, California. He's also an accomplished author and America's leading authority on peak performance. He's been studying it for years. He studies people who get things done and comes out with formulas about how they manage to get that done. How are they so effective? He's written several books about it. One of them is called Peak Performance. The other one is entitled, I wrote it down here, entitled Second to None. So Dr. Garfield, he's no slouch. This guy's capable. So one day, he's going across the Oakland-San Francisco Bay Bridge. When he runs into quite a little hang-up of traffic, he's in a hurry, he's got an appointment in the town, and he's kind of caught, and you know, you can't do anything when it backs up at the bridge. You just got to wait it out. So he's waiting it out, and he's drumming his fingers on the steering wheel and saying, oh boy, oh boy. And then, as he gets closer to his toll booth, another dimension comes into the picture. Suddenly, he hears music, loud music, jiving music, happy music. And as he gets up within 2 cars of his toll booth, he sees where that music's coming. It's coming from his toll booth, from the toll taker who is in that booth dancing. And I'm not talking about this guy's dancing. He's flying. Now he's doing his job. He's taking tolls. But in the meantime, he's moving. He's flying. He's getting all kinds of things done. Finally, when Garfield gets up to the booth, he says to the kid, "What are you doing?" Kid says, "Well, I'm having a party." Garfield says, "Well, what about all those others? There's 17 booths." You look at what about all those people? Kid says, "They're not invited." Isn't it beautiful? So he says to the kid, "When do you get off?" Kid says, "I get off at 4:30. Dr. Garfield says, "If I come back at 4:30, can I take you out for a milkshake and a hamburger? I want to find out how you do what you do." Young man says, "Yeah, we can go right away." He points to this hamburger joint that's within eyesight of the bridge. So sure enough, that afternoon, somewhere around 5 o'clock, we find the two of these people gathered together across a booth in that hamburger joint. And Garfield says to the kid, "Tell me about you. How is it you can have all that fun in that toll booth. And the young man looks at him. He says, he points at all the 17 booths. He says, "What do those look like to you?" And Garfield says, "They look like toll booths." Kid says, "No imagination." "Okay," says Garfield, "what do they look like to you?" Kid says, "Vertical coffins." Garfield says, "What are you talking about?" Kid says, "I can prove it. Listen." He says, "Every day at 8:30 in the morning, live people climb into those booths. Then they die for 8 hours. At 4:30, like Lazarus, raising from the dead, they re-emerge and they go home. For 8 hours, their brains are on hold, they are dead on the job, they're just going through the motions." Garfield listens. He says, "So what makes it different for you? Why are you having such a good time?" And the young guy's eyes started to glisten. He said, "You got to understand, I was studying to be a dancer. Had some of the finest teachers in the Bay Area. But then my dad got sick, and I had to make some money to help my mom out so we could hold things together." Garfield tilted his head in empathy, and the young man said, "Oh, no, don't feel sorry for me. This has turned into a magnificent opportunity. You see," he said, "my bosses are in there," and he pointed toward the administration building. He said, "They're in there, and they're paying for my training. I'm still going to be a dancer. I'm just going to be a better dancer." And Garfield said to him, "But what about the boredom?" And the young man smiled. And I want you to see the answer he gave, Francie. He said, "What boredom? I have a corner office, glass on all sides. I can see the Golden Gate, San Francisco, the Berkeley Hills, half the Western world vacations here, and I just stroll in there every day and start dancing," says Garfield. You know, sometimes, and this is true for us, it's true for me, it's true for you, true for America right now, true for Jupiter First right now. Sometimes we have no choice about the predicaments life passes our way. But, says Garfield, all peak performers know we always have a choice. No matter what life throws at us, we always have a choice about how we are going to respond. I say, do we respond with despair, or do we respond with faith? Next week, I'm going to talk about the tools our Creator God has already given us with which to lay claim to the future that same God has already planned for us. Amen. Please stand.